somewhere in Binh Dinh Province, 1967. The light here does not arrive so much as filter down through the triple canopy in slow columns, catching smoke from distant fires and making the jungle floor look, in the early morning, like the inside of a cathedral no living person ever consecrated. A United States Army patrol moves in column along a route the intelligence maps show as marginally clear. The point man is 40 meters ahead. Behind him, spaced out at intervals the manual specifies, the rest of the squad. And somewhere near the middle of the file, where Doctrine places him, and where every trained soldier in the enemy's army expects him to be, the lieutenant stops. He raises a closed fist. The column halts. He opens his map case, takes out the folded chart, turns it against the terrain, and bends slightly to read. A compass in his left hand, a grease pencil behind his ear. The man is completely exposed for perhaps 30 seconds. In a cleared position at the tree line behind him, at a distance of roughly 150 meters, a North Vietnamese sniper has laid his rifle across the fork of a branch he trimmed and set in place 2 hours before. He has the lieutenant in his scope. The shot is clear. The range is certain. The light is in his favor. He does not take it. Not yet. Because the doctrine he carries, codified in training documents that American intelligence analysts would recover and study in the following years, specifically instructs him otherwise. The man with the map is not the target. Not first. Understanding why that instruction existed, what chain of reasoning produced it, and what it cost the United States Army to answer it is the account this investigation opens. If this story is pulling you in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who is listening. The People's Army of Vietnam was not, by any serious analysis, a guerrilla force that survived on improvisation and local knowledge. That reading flatters neither side. The PAVN and the armed branches of the National Liberation Front that fought alongside it were a learning institution, and the distinction matters enormously when you try to understand what they built. They maintained a systematic practice of after-action analysis that the United States Army, with all its formal doctrine and institutional memory, took years to fully reckon with. After every engagement, at every level from the squad upward, commanders and their men conducted what the PAVN called KEM-DM, criticism and self-criticism sessions, in which every decision was examined and every outcome attributed to a specific cause. The lessons were written down, condensed, and sent upward. From the higher staff, they were reformulated and sent back down as directives, field manuals, and memoranda distributed to the platoon level. The system was slow by American standards. It was also relentless. It never stopped running. And over the years, it accumulated a picture of the American way of fighting that was more accurate in several specific respects than the picture American commanders had assembled of their own units. The sniper teams that operated in the PAVN's various formations were part of this system and were studied and trained within it. Before a mission, a PAVN sniper team received a briefing that included, where intelligence allowed, specific information about the American unit they were likely to encounter. The briefing described the unit's known patrol patterns, the route it used, the terrain it favored, and the personnel it typically deployed. The briefing also covered what the PAVN's training documents called the hierarchy of targets, a ranked list of the figures in an American patrol that the sniper was expected to identify and engage in a specific order. That order had been arrived at through years of engagement reports, prisoner interviews, and the analysis of how American units responded when specific individuals were removed from the fight. It was not guesswork. It was the product of a learning institution doing what learning institutions do. A United States military study produced during the war found that 88% of all engagements against American forces in South Vietnam were initiated by the enemy. The enemy chose when to fight and, by extension, set the terms of most encounters. This was not a product of terrain advantage or familiarity with the ground alone. It was a product of study. PAVN and VC units spent, on average, roughly 1 day in 30 fighting. The remaining days were invested in training, intelligence gathering, preparation, and analysis of the enemy they faced. In an era before satellites and digital surveillance, the PAVN built its picture of the American military through observation, capture documents, defector debriefings, and what its political officers described in training materials as learning to see the American. That phrase appeared in multiple documents from the early years of the war. It was not metaphorical. It meant precisely what it said: watch, record, understand, and exploit. What they saw from the earliest engagements of 1965 onward was a battlefield shaped by American technology in ways that produced specific, repeatable patterns. Helicopters arrived and departed on predictable flight axes. Artillery fire was called in through procedures that could be anticipated once the initiating contact was identified. Supply columns moved along routes that changed less often than Doctrine recommended. American smoke marking practices, used to signal airstrikes and helicopter landing zones, were studied until PAVN units became adept at imitating the color-coded signals and redirecting the aircraft that were meant to respond to them. Firing tables were constructed and disseminated for different types of American aircraft. Countermeasures against the M113 armored personnel carrier, which was devastating to PAVN formations when it first appeared in force, were published, debated, and incorporated into training. The VC and PAVN battle philosophy placed great stress in the records that survive, on learning and adaptability at the lowest levels. Units were expected to be problem solvers, and the results of their problem-solving were fed back up the chain and out to other formations. This process never ceased. But above all, the PAVN studied the internal architecture of the American small unit in the field. What they found inside that architecture was a vulnerability so structural that it required no superior numbers and no lucky contact to exploit. It required one trained marksman and a cold understanding of the machine he was watching. The machine was the platoon. At its center was a two-man cluster that every engagement report, every prisoner interrogation, and every after-action document kept identifying as the decisive node of the whole. The officer, usually a lieutenant, carried the map and the command authority. At his shoulder, never more than 2 or 3 steps away, stood the radio telephone operator. The RTO, a young man, often among the most trusted in the platoon, trained to a standard that the Army's communication schools at Fort Gordon and Fort Monmouth considered thorough. He carried the N/PRC 25 radio, which weighed 13.5 pounds empty, closer to 20 with fresh batteries loaded, and which rose above him on a 10-foot whip antenna that could be read at distance the way a flagpole can be read from across a town square. The antenna was the identifier. It caught light and movement in open country and jungle clearings, and fixed the eye of anyone who knew what they were looking for. The PAVN trained its snipers to find the antenna before they found anything else. The antenna moved when the column moved. The antenna stopped when the column stopped. The man beneath the antenna, by doctrine and by practical necessity, was always within arm's reach of the officer, which meant that finding the antenna found both of them simultaneously. At ranges of 100 to 200 meters in close terrain, identifying the 10-foot whip was often possible when identifying individual soldiers by face or rank was not. It was the most reliable indicator in the patrol of where the command element was, and the command element was where the doctrine said to look first. The RTO's function extended the officer's reach into every engagement that required contact beyond the immediate line of sight. When the platoon made contact with the enemy, the RTO called the company headquarters. He called in the grid coordinates for artillery support. He talked the helicopter gunships into their firing runs. He coordinated the medevac helicopter that brought the dead and wounded out. Without the RTO, the platoon could still fight. It fought alone. It could not bring the machine of close air support and indirect fire to bear. And those were the elements that made American infantry so dangerous in anything other than a straight exchange of fire in open ground. The platoon could not call for reinforcement. It could not get its wounded out unless someone physically ran the distance to the next position and relayed the message by voice. Cutting the RTO out of the action was not removing one soldier from the line. It was removing the officer's power projection, the mechanism that translated a lieutenant's decision into artillery rounds falling on a designated grid square several kilometers away. The radio also did something else that is worth understanding before examining the doctrine designed to exploit it. Within the American command system, the radio created a hierarchy that was audible to anyone with a captured set. The commanding officer of any unit called himself by a number, 6. When you heard on the frequency the words, "This is Red Fox 6," you were hearing the commanding officer of that unit, advertising his presence and his location to anyone monitoring the channel. The RTO, standing beside the officer, was the instrument through which the Six announced himself to the world, and through which the world announced itself back to the Six. The PAVN had captured PRC-25 radios from dead and wounded Americans and from overrun positions throughout the mid-1960s. They used them not only to listen to American radio communications, but to understand the callsign architecture that identified the command element in every transmission. When an RTO spoke and identified his commander as Six, the content of the message was less important than the confirmation that the RTO and his Six were in a specific location, and that both could be found if you knew where to look. A PAVN sniper team in the field typically consisted of two men, the shooter and an observer whose function went beyond calling the shot. The observer read the American column before the shooter committed to a firing position, identifying the sequence of targets, timing the patrol's movement against the cover and angle available, and confirming the spacing and position of the command element within the file. This two-man function is notable because the identification process required time and patience that a single rifleman working alone could not easily generate. A PAVN sniper who could not hold a position long enough to watch an American patrol resolve into its component parts, separating the officer and the RTO from the riflemen around them, could not apply the doctrine. The doctrine required observation before it required marksmanship. The sniper who fired too early, who took the first clear shot before the full composition of the column was understood, was a sniper who might spin his shot on the wrong man and compress the tactical opportunity that the doctrine had trained him to maximize. The pre-mission briefing format that PAVN teams received addressed this directly. Teams were trained not to engage on first visual contact with an American element. They were trained to observe, to locate the antenna, to follow it until the man beneath it and the man beside him had resolved into clarity at the range at which the shot was being planned. In terrain where this took longer because the cover was denser or because the American column was moving at a pace that compressed the observation window, teams were trained to wait for the column's next stop, the natural pause when the officer would consult his map and the entire command element would concentrate in the narrow space that the patrol's movement had spread it across. That pause was the moment the opening scenario in Binh Dinh Province describes. It was not a chance event. It was an anticipated event, recurring at intervals that observation of American patrol behavior could predict with reasonable accuracy. The American habit of stopping to read the map was, in the PAVN's operational thinking, not merely a tactical vulnerability, but a timing mechanism. The sniper had only to follow the antenna and wait for the map to come out. The PAVN understood this with a precision that appears repeatedly in the documentary record. Captured documents from the mid-1960s describe what communist military trainers referred to as priority targets for direct fire engagements. The radio operator appears consistently at or near the top of that list. The officer does not. This was not an oversight. It was a deliberate inversion of what most armies of that period, and most armies of the century before it, had taught their soldiers to prioritize. The conventional logic of war said, kill the leader and the unit loses direction. The PAVN's reasoning said something else entirely. It said, kill the leader's communications and the leader is already finished before he falls. The man with the map is only dangerous as long as he can translate what he sees on that map into coordinated action across fire support systems he does not physically control. Without the radio, the map is paper and the officer holding it is a man alone in the jungle with knowledge that cannot reach anyone. There is also a mechanical consequence to the targeting choice that the PAVN had worked out in practice long before it appeared in formal doctrine. The RTO stood at the officer's shoulder because that was where the officer needed him. When the patrol halted and the officer read the map, the RTO was the nearest figure. When the officer moved, the RTO moved with him. When the officer needed the handset, the two men occupied the same narrow space in the world. A single round that struck the RTO at the ranges that characterized most jungle contact had a meaningful probability, depending on angle and caliber, of also striking or incapacitating the officer beside him. The PAVN's cost calculation ran as follows: shoot the RTO, cut communications, wound or kill the officer in the same exchange, and leave the platoon with no commander and no ability to call for the things that made the American position survivable. The precision of that reasoning explains why the man with the map was specifically taught to wait. There was another dimension to the doctrine that emerges from prisoner interrogations and from the accounts of American soldiers who survived extended contact with PAVN sniper teams. The North Vietnamese understood something about the experience of the American officer in the field that many American commanders had not yet fully articulated for themselves. When a man who is not a target watches the men immediately beside him get shot, the experience is not the same as being shot himself. A dead man feels nothing and imposes no further burden on the living. A living officer who has watched his radio operator collapse at his shoulder, who knows the antenna is down and the handset is dead and the helicopters do not know where he is, confronts a specific condition that degrades decision-making in ways that a clean casualty does not. He is a man operating at the limit of his training, without his instrument, in active contact with an enemy whose position he has not fixed, and with full knowledge that no artillery and no aircraft are coming unless he can find another way to get word out. The PAVN found this state, a leader alive but stripped of function, more operationally useful in many engagements than a leader simply removed and replaced. This is not speculation. It appears in the accounts of American platoon leaders who survived ambushes that followed this pattern, and who described the experience in terms that veterans of other wars sometimes found difficult to recognize. The shot that did not come for them. The man who fell at their side while they remained standing. The dead radio. The decision they had to make in the following seconds without any of the resources they had been trained to rely upon. The official record and the personal accounts align on this point more clearly than they align on most questions about how the war was fought. The numbers from that period give partial shape to the story. A group of 28 communication specialists trained at Fort Ord, California, arrived in South Vietnam on Christmas Eve, 1966. 1 week later, 26 of them were dead. This figure appears in veterans' accounts preserved in the post-war record and has been cited in the histories of Army signal operations in Vietnam. It is not presented here as representative of any average week across the war's full span. It captures the density of the targeting pattern that American radio operators encountered from the earliest phase of substantial United States ground involvement. The 10-foot antenna of the PRC-25 was not a design flaw. It was the equipment the Army had determined was necessary for reliable communication in terrain that absorbed and scattered radio signals at the frequencies involved. It was also, from any observation position at 200 meters or closer, a marking system for every PAVN soldier who had been trained which man to find in the column first. What happened to the officer in those engagements varied. Some were killed in the same burst of fire that took the RTO. Some survived the initial contact and reorganize their units through voice command and direct physical movement, doing the work of the radio with their bodies instead of their equipment, moving from position to position within the platoon's perimeter to keep control of men who could no longer hear the handset. And some survived in a condition that the after-action reports and medical records could document, but that the military vocabulary of the time was not well equipped to name. They had been trained to lead. The force that killed their men had specifically chosen to leave them. That is a particular kind of damage, and it does not appear on casualty lists. The broader picture of how target priority played out in practice comes from the battle record. At the Drang Valley in November of 1965, the first major engagement between United States Army forces and PAVN regulars, American commanders documented that their radio operators and officers were being singled out from the first minutes of contact. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore, commanding the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry at Landing Zone X-Ray, later described PAVN behavior that demonstrated a disciplined understanding of how American units were organized and where their communications nodes were positioned within the column. The fight at X-Ray lasted 3 days at a cost that made it one of the most studied small unit engagements of the war. When commanders analyzed what they had learned about PAVN targeting in those 3 days, the pattern of the radio operator as a priority target appeared clearly enough to enter the Army's internal reporting on the engagement and to shape the training that followed across the divisions then arriving in country. At Ong Tan in October of 1967, a PAVN Force Ambush Company D of the 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, after a period of patient observation. The PAVN had watched American units conduct airstrike operations and had noted that American forces reliably moved in to conduct mop-up sweeps the following day. The ambush was set not for the strike itself, but for the sweep. Among the first soldiers hit in the opening burst of fire, by the accounts of survivors, were the radio operators and the company officers. The company spent the remainder of the engagement functionally blind and, without artillery coordination, trying to maintain contact with higher headquarters through surviving handsets passed between men who moved from position to position as the PAVN pressed from multiple directions. The engagement produced nearly 60 Americans killed and a similar number wounded from a force of roughly 155 soldiers engaged, one of the worst loss rates of any single company-level action in the division's entire Vietnam service. In February of 1967, during Operation Junction City in Thanh Ninh Province, a platoon from the 1st Infantry Division was conducting a patrol through dense vegetation when it came under fire from small arms, automatic weapons, and mortars. Among the first Americans identified and shot by the ambushing force were the platoon leader and the other key personnel positioned immediately around him. This targeting of the command element in the opening seconds of contact, leaving the senior surviving NCO to take control of the platoon that had just lost its officer in the first exchange, appears in account after account from the middle years of the war. It was not random. The PAVN had identified who the Americans would turn to when the officer fell and had structured its opening fire to remove as many of the succession candidates as possible in the first moments before the surviving soldiers could fix the ambush's position and begin returning effective fire. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's far more in the record still to cover. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. The United States Army was not unaware of what was happening. It was slow. The institutional pace at which large armies recognize tactical patterns, formalize the recognition, and produce doctrine in response is not the pace of the individual soldier who has been in country for 3 months and already knows, without needing a manual, that carrying the radio is the most dangerous assignment in his platoon. By the middle years of the 1960s, soldiers in many American units had developed informal practices that predated any formal acknowledgement from higher command. Radio operators in some units began walking with the antenna bent down and tucked against the radio frame, accepting reduced range in exchange for reduced visibility at the distances where contact most often occurred in close terrain. Others looped the antenna into a lower arc that sacrificed transmission performance at distance, but was considerably less visible at the ranges that mattered in jungle fighting. These were individual improvisations, unit-level adaptations, the kind of solutions that emerge from the bottom of a military organization rather than its top. The broader adaptation that took place in American units between 1965 and 1970 was not, for the most part, the product of formal orders from above. It was the product of a learning process that ran parallel to the PAVN zone, at roughly the same pace, and through roughly the same mechanism, which is the survival of soldiers who had learned something and the death of soldiers who had not. Platoon leaders who had been in country for 6 months moved differently than platoon leaders who had been in country for 6 days. They put more distance between themselves and the RTO. They moved in positions that did not place them at the obvious center of the file. They issued their maps to their platoon sergeants as well as carrying their own. They left their pistols behind the wire and went out with M16s. None of these changes appeared in a formal directive at the beginning of the war. Most of them appeared in formal directives at the end of the war, by which point the soldiers in the field had already been practicing them for years. The most visible formal change was what happened to officer rank insignia. In the United States Army of the early Vietnam period, commissioned officers displayed their rank on collar points and shoulder boards in metal, bars and oak leaves for junior and field grade officers respectively. The insignia caught light the way the RTO's antenna caught it, and they served the same function from an enemy's perspective. They told a trained observer who in the column was worth watching. In some combat units, the practice of removing or covering rank insignia in the field had begun as early as 1965, driven by the same informal bottom-up process that had started bending the antennas down. Officers took the bars off their collars before patrols went out. Some units adopted the practice uniformly. Others maintained standard insignia until casualties in their own officer ranks made the argument in place of any directive from higher command. The salute was a connected problem and, in some ways, a more dangerous one, because saluting is not merely a private gesture. It is a performance conducted between two people in a defined way that is visible at distance and instantly legible to anyone who knows what it signifies. A soldier raising his right hand to his forehead in the direction of another soldier communicates one piece of information with perfect clarity to any trained observer at any range. The man being saluted outranks the man saluting him. Carlos Hathcock, the Marine Corps sniper whose confirmed kills during his first tour stood at 93 and whose actual total was believed by those who serve alongside him to be considerably higher, described in post-war interviews how he identified a North Vietnamese general during one of his most demanding missions. The general was surrounded by other soldiers, and the distances involved made individual rank insignia unreadable. What gave the general away was what happened when other soldiers came near him. They saluted. The behavior, performed by the men around the target rather than by the target himself, marked him with more precision than any medal on a collar could have at that range. This is the symmetry of the problem both sides were navigating simultaneously. The same behavior will tell the PAVN was exploiting against American officers in the field existed in mirror form for American snipers hunting PAVN leadership. Both sides were learning to read movement and behavior rather than insignia, because behavior was harder to suppress than metal and cloth. The American Army's formal response to the identification problem produced changes across different command levels. The prohibition on saluting in the field became effectively universal in combat units by the middle years of the war. It was never uniformly enforced. There are accounts from the late 1960s of soldiers being corrected by superiors who felt discipline was slipping when men were not rendering proper courtesies in areas behind the wire where the enemy could not observe them. But in the platoons and companies conducting operations in terrain where observation by the enemy was a genuine daily possibility, saluting had ceased in practice by the period between 1967 and 1969. The informal replacement in some units was what soldiers called the sniper check. Instead of raising an arm in a gesture readable across a clearing, a soldier acknowledged an officer with a word or a nod that carried no further than the man it was addressed to. The name was dry. The logic was correct. The resistance to these changes was real and documented. Not all of it came from indifference or ignorance of what was happening in the field. Some of it came from officers who had genuine concerns about what the changes would cost in terms of military discipline and unit cohesion. A unit in which the officer cannot be distinguished from the men he leads at close range is a unit that has made itself somewhat harder to command as well as somewhat harder to kill. The argument was not frivolous. Small unit discipline under fire, the capacity of a soldier to identify the person whose orders he should follow in the first seconds of an ambush when smoke and noise have destroyed the spatial geometry of the patrol's original formation, depends partly on the ability to locate the officer by sight. The PAVN's targeting doctrine, by eliminating what made the officer visible, also eliminated what made him findable by his own men when the contact opened. The informal solutions that units developed acknowledged this problem. A soldier who knew his lieutenant's face and build did not need to find rank insignia on a collar to locate him in a firefight. But a newly arrived replacement who had spent 6 hours in the unit before the patrol went out had fewer such landmarks. The changes that protected the officer from one threat created a different kind of cost at the platoon level, and that cost was part of why the changes were never uniform, and why some units resisted them longer than others did. The adaptation also ran unevenly across the war's duration for a reason that has nothing directly to do with tactical doctrine. The rotation system that moved American soldiers in and out of Vietnam on individual 12-month tours meant that experienced units were continuously losing the men who had most fully learned the lessons the country taught. A sergeant who had spent 8 months understanding exactly how much distance to keep between himself and his commanding officer, and why, was not replaced by a sergeant who had already learned that. He was replaced by a man who had learned what the Army had formally put in its manuals, which in many cases lagged the field reality by years. The practical knowledge that individual soldiers had accumulated a considerable cost had to be reacquired by each new cohort that arrived in country without having absorbed it from the one that preceded them. The officer's weapon underwent a parallel change. Through the early years of the American buildup, commissioned officers carried the M1911A1 pistol as their standard sidearm, worn in a holster on the belt or across the shoulder. The holster was visible at range and served as an identifier, a man wearing a pistol in a patrol of M16 carriers was almost certainly an officer or a senior NCO. An enemy who could identify the holster at 200 meters had already narrowed his targeting considerably before the patrol came within effective small arms range. By the later years of the war, the practice of officers carrying the standard M16 rifle rather than the pistol had spread through much of the infantry. This was not a formally mandated change in every instance. It was another adaptation driven from below by the recognition that carrying the weapon every other soldier in the patrol was carrying was the most effective way to become unremarkable within it. An officer with an M16 in a column of men carrying M16s offers no visible indication of rank or function to an observer watching from the tree line. An officer with a pistol in that same column is the man the PAVN's pre-mission briefing had described. The map itself required its own adjustment. In the earliest period of the American Ground War, the officer held the map because it was a command tool and it lived with the command element. Stopping to read, it marked the command element with a precision that no amount of spacing in the column could fully obscure, because the stop itself communicated meaning to any observer who understood patrol dynamics. A platoon that moves and then stops and then clusters around one man has identified that man as the person who decides whether it moves again and in which direction. By the later years of the war, a number of units had adopted the practice of distributing map segments or full copy charts to more soldiers than Doctrine strictly required, so that the act of halting to read a chart was no longer concentrated in the one man whose halting to read a chart was the most operationally dangerous behavior in the column. The change was incremental rather than decisive, and it was accompanied by a broader shift in how officers tried to control their units in the field. The officer who stopped in the middle of the file to read a map was replaced, where possible, by an officer who had studied the route before the patrol left the wire and who adjusted his read of the terrain on the move rather than by stopping visibly in a position that every trained observer in the tree line had been specifically told to watch for. General Creighton Abrams, who took command of Military Assistance Command Vietnam in 1968 and whose approach to the war differed substantially from his predecessor William Westmoreland's in a number of documented respects, was among the commanders who addressed the radio communication vulnerability most directly and most formally. Abrams had an infantry background and a practiced understanding of how small units in contact functioned in reality rather than in field manuals. In 1970, he formally acknowledged in Internal Communications the scope of the problem that American radio practices had created over the preceding years. His concern was not only the physical targeting of RTOs, which by that point was documented extensively across multiple operational areas and in the reports of nearly every division that had served in the theater, but the deeper problem that had run alongside it for years without receiving the same formal acknowledgement at the command level. The enemy was listening. The N/PRC 25 radios that American units relied on for communication were not encrypted in any meaningful operational sense during most of the war's active period. The PAVN had captured PRC 25 sets from dead and wounded Americans and from overrun positions throughout the middle years of the conflict. They used them to monitor American radio communications with a fidelity that allowed them, in some operational areas, to build accurate pictures of unit dispositions, intended patrol routes, timing, and tactical intentions from the traffic they intercepted. The NVA's reconnaissance battalions, tasked specifically with gathering intelligence on American units in their operational areas, were documented as profiling American formations to the degree that they knew not only which unit was opposing them, but the methods of navigation that unit used, the weapons it carried, and the communication patterns that identified its command element. American units would radio their grid coordinates to request artillery support and move to the called location to find a PAVN had already vacated it. Concerns about communication security had been raised by American intelligence officers throughout the mid-1960s. Too many of those concerns were addressed at the administrative level rather than acted upon at the operational one. The Army developed an encryption system. The KY-38, part of the Nestor program, provided genuine voice encryption that the PAVN could not break with a captured PRC-25. The device worked. It also added 25 pounds to the radio load. In a theater where a fully equipped soldier was already moving through heat and terrain while carrying 60 to 80 pounds of equipment, The encryption device that solved the interception problem created a physical burden that units in the field frequently resisted without direct orders requiring its use. The trade-off was real, and it landed directly on the individual RTO, the young man already identified as the most targeted soldier in his platoon, who was now being asked to carry an additional 25 pounds as the solution to the problem of being killed for what he was already carrying. The implications of communications interception extended beyond the specific problem of locating the command element. They reached into the quality of every engagement the Army fought in areas where PAVN reconnaissance units had established sustained monitoring of American radio traffic. A unit that could be heard was a unit that could be anticipated, and a unit that could be anticipated forfeited most of the advantage that American firepower was supposed to provide. Artillery support called in on an open frequency told the enemy, before the rounds arrived, exactly what grid the call was coming from and approximately how long the American unit intended to remain at that position. The interval between calling for fire and the fire arriving had always been a window of vulnerability for the calling unit. In terrain where the PAVN was monitoring the frequency on which the call was made, that window was also a window of information, delivered in clear language at the speed of radio transmission, directly to the force that was currently occupying the ground the American unit expected to reach next. American signals intelligence officers had documented the interception problem in internal reports as early as 1964 and continue to document it throughout the build-up years. The difficulty was not recognizing the problem. The difficulty was that the communications architecture the Army depended on in the field was not easily modified in the time available and under the conditions that prevailed. Switching frequencies had limited value against an opponent who could monitor a broad enough spectrum to follow the traffic. Procedure words and brevity codes reduced the intelligibility of specific content, but could not conceal the pattern of activity, the rhythm of call and response that an experienced listener could use to locate a unit even without decoding what it was saying. The formal solutions, including the KY-38 and the encryption protocols that eventually followed it, addressed the content problem. They could not address the emission problem. The simple fact that a radio transmitting on any frequency in any terrain was announcing its presence to anyone with a receiver tuned to that band and the patience to listen. There was one more dimension to the PAVN targeting doctrine that deserves direct examination, because it explains why the instruction to hold fire on the officer sometimes extended beyond a single calculation about communications priority, and why the man with the map was sometimes left standing when everyone else around him had been taken. The PAVN study of American battlefield behavior had identified, in documents from the mid-1960s, a consistent feature of American unit cohesion that could be turned against the unit in the field. The American soldier, they observed and recorded with specificity, would stop fighting to help his wounded. Captain Dan Shawley, an American officer who served in Vietnam and whose observations were preserved in the historical record, described the same feature from inside the American line. He wrote that one of the great attributes of the American soldier was his willingness to help someone who was hurt regardless of the consequences, and that this attribute was something a commander had to manage actively, because the soldier who moved to help the wounded was no longer firing his rifle and had been removed from the fight as effectively as if he had been hit himself. The PAVN used this. The instruction to wound rather than kill, which appears in several captured documents from the early and middle periods of the war, was not mercy. It was a force multiplier calculation. One dead soldier required evacuation and imposed a fixed cost on the unit's ability to continue its mission. One living wounded soldier, one who was audible in the jungle, required the immediate attention of multiple other soldiers who stopped what they were doing and moved toward the sound. PAVN training documents estimated that a single wounded man in a small unit action occupied the efforts of 3 to 5 other soldiers in the immediate minutes after he fell. A shot that killed removed one fighter from the engagement. A shot that wounded removed several. When applied to the officer specifically, the calculation extended further. A wounded officer who could not effectively command was a drain on his unit's resources in a way that a dead officer, cleanly replaced by the senior NCO, was not. A wounded officer who could still speak and still issue instructions, but could not move freely and could not call fires was a burden that the platoon had to carry into the rest of the engagement. When this is applied against the targeting hierarchy as a whole, the internal coherence of the doctrine becomes plain. A sniper with one shot before he must relocate does not take the officer. He takes the RTO, or the man standing nearest to the officer, because that one shot simultaneously cuts communications, generates a casualty that pulls other soldiers away from their positions, and leaves the officer to face the following 30 seconds without his instrument and without any way to call for what is flying in the sky above him, but cannot find him without a grid. The man with the map is the most visible figure in the patrol. By the doctrine that produced a specific instruction against taking the obvious shot, he is also the target that served the PAVN's operational requirements last. The adaptation the United States Army produced in response was never clean, never complete, and never fully resolved the problem of the radio operator as the most exposed position in the platoon. The 10-foot antenna eventually gave way to shorter configurations for closer range terrain. The officer's pistol was replaced in many units by the standard rifle. The rank insignia left the collar before patrols went out. The salute disappeared from the field with no formal order and no date that anyone can attach to the record with certainty. These changes accumulated over years, driven by the most effective teacher the Army has ever had, which is contact with an enemy who has identified where the machine breaks and pressed on that place repeatedly until the machine changes or stops working. The changes were never complete because the underlying vulnerability was structural rather than procedural. As long as the officer needed the radio operator and the radio operator needed to be at the officer's shoulder, the two-man cluster at the center of the platoon would be identifiable to anyone who watched it long enough to understand what it was. What the PAVN had constructed was a doctrine that looked at the obvious target and asked the second question. The obvious target is the officer. The second question is, what makes the officer dangerous? The answer was not the map. The map recorded terrain. The answer was the radio, and the man carrying it, and the system of fires and aviation and medical evacuation that the man with the radio could summon in the time it took to read 6 digits off a grid reference. Remove the radio, and you remove the force multiplier. Remove the force multiplier, and the officer with the map is already reduced to the level of the enemy he is facing, a man in the jungle with a weapon and a position and no particular advantage over the force that can see him and he cannot see. Remove the radio, and the map becomes a record of where the officer is standing with no way to convert that knowledge into action against the force currently looking at him. There's a kind of military thinking that the record of this war rewards above most others. It is the thinking that refuses to stop at the first-order effect. The first-order effect of shooting the officer is removing a decision-maker. The second-order effect of shooting the radio operator is removing the mechanism by which all decisions become action, while leaving the decision-maker alive to witness the consequence and to function at reduced capacity for the remainder of the engagement. The PAVN chose the second because they had done the arithmetic on both and understood that a neutralized officer alive in the field was more valuable to their operational objectives than a dead officer who would be replaced within hours. The American Army took years to understand what was being calculated and longer still to change enough of its own visible behavior to make the calculation less reliable in the encounters that followed. The North Vietnamese sniper in the tree line does not shoot the man with the map. He finds a man beside the officer, the one with the antenna rising 10 feet above his shoulders, the one who controls the fires that could end this engagement in 30 seconds if the call goes through. That man goes down first. And what has happened when he does is not the loss of one soldier from the patrol. What has happened is the severing of the officer from everything that made his rank and his map and his training capable of hurting the force that just reached out from the tree line to find him. The officer is alive. He is standing in the clearing with the map. He has the compass and the grease pencil and the chart. He has everything except the one thing that makes any of it matter in a jungle where the enemy holds the initiative. The officer survives that contact, or does not. The radio operator at his shoulder survives, or does not. The war produced hundreds of thousands of both kinds of ending, and the arithmetic does not resolve in favor of any of them. What it resolves into is this: an instruction written down in a training manual that told a soldier exactly who not to shoot, the reasons behind it, and the particular way in which leaving a man alive could serve a purpose that killing him could not. That instruction changed how the United States Army fought. It changed how the Army dressed its officers in the field, managed its communications infrastructure, thought about the relationship between command authority and the instruments through which command becomes real, and trained the men who carried the radios. The legacy of those changes reaches further than the war itself. The modern United States Army does not salute its officers in the field. Its officers carry rifles. Its radio operators do not walk at the shoulder of the commander in the way they once did. The call sign that identifies the commanding officer as 6 is still used, but the communications that carry it are encrypted. These are small things, taken individually. They are the residue of a doctrine that the PAVN wrote down and that the Army paid to understand. The legacy of what had been learned, paid for, and built into the Army's way of operating after Vietnam is not easily separated from the broader institutional changes that the war produced. The Army that emerged from Vietnam was, in a range of specific ways, more cautious about concentrating its command signatures in visible configurations than the Army that had entered it. This caution showed up not as a formal doctrine, but as a habit of mind distributed across the generation of officers who had learned their profession in that terrain and brought those habits into the classrooms and training ranges of the post-war institution. They wrote field manuals that reflected what they knew and trained lieutenants who had never been to Vietnam to avoid behaviors that had cost the RTOs of their predecessors their lives in places those lieutenants could not locate on a map without being reminded where Binh Dinh Province was. The question of communications vulnerability as a command problem, rather than purely as a signal corps problem, found its way into how the Army thought about battle command in the 1970s and 1980s. Distributing command functions so that a single point of failure could not disable the entire mechanism was a principle that Vietnam had demonstrated with great clarity at the platoon level, and that applied with equal force to the larger organizational structures planners were designing for potential conflict in Europe. The underlying question of how to prevent a military force from being decapitated by a precise first strike was the same question the PAVN had asked about the American platoon in 1965 and answered with a rifle and a target list. The 6 call sign survives. The term is so embedded in American military culture that it has passed from operational use into common American idiom, appearing in film and fiction and casual speech among people who have never served and never thought about where the term came from. What it came from is a radio architecture that organized the American command structure around an audible, predictable, and exploitable signal. The PAVN found that signal and built a doctrine to exploit it. The Army kept the term and encrypted the signal. Both choices are a kind of legacy, and together they describe the full shape of what was learned between the tree lines and the clearing in Binh Dinh Province in the years between 1965 and 1973. The man with the map, the lieutenant standing in the clearing in Binh Dinh Province with his compass and his chart and his grease pencil, eventually moves on. The patrol reassembles. The column begins to move again through the filtered light and the smoke and the particular quiet of that country. The quiet that is not silence, but something else. The quiet that precedes contact in that terrain the way a drawn breath precedes a word. The sniper in the tree line has already found his target. It is not the man with the map. It was never the man with the map. That was the doctrine. That was the instruction. And for years, in clearing after clearing and on patrol after patrol across the full expanse of that war, the instruction held, and the United States Army paid in full for what it took to understand what the instruction meant and how to answer it. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen carry the story forward. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.